Let us start this dialogue. We have the privilege to host Nick Zirnicek. Thank you, Nick, for accepting our invitation. In a way, I think that for many of us, your work has been a key reference in developing a critical approach to the study of digital platforms and in particular platform capitalism. Your 2016 book, Platform Capitalism, is kind of rare success, meaning that it is a short book, but at the same time very effective in outlining a problematic and not superficial in dealing with its implications. I guess you are, in a way, familiar with our European research project, INCA. It's a project on big infrastructural platforms. It's a project on GAFAM, to put it quickly, and particularly it is focused on the politics of big infrastructural platforms as a kind of privilege key to the study of platform capitalism. So in a way, our project takes as a point of departure the idea that digital platforms confront us with a kind of blurring of the boundary between the political and the economic dimension. I will stage a dialogue with you, asking a couple of questions for 45 to 50 minutes, and then we will open the discussion to the floor and to the researchers on the INCA project. And the first question, the first topic I would like to discuss with you regards precisely the nature of big infrastructural platforms. In your 2016 book, you outlined a kind of typology of digital platforms, and I have the impression that big infrastructural platforms cut across the different types of platforms you distinguished. So, first question is, what do you think about this infrastructural character, which in a way is constitutive of digital platforms as such, but is of course particularly pronounced in the case of GAFAM?
Yeah, thank you for that. Thank you as well for inviting me and for everybody attending this. I think it's a great question. I think in my own sort of thought recently, I've been turning sort of more and more away from platforms as a key category, more and more towards infrastructures as a dominant category. I think this particularly has to do with a couple key things. One is the growing influence of cloud computing in particular. Cloud computing, at least in my typology in platform capitalism, was sort of one type of platform. But I think since then, in nearly 10 years since then, cloud computing has become much more significant, much more powerful, much more expansive. It's become a key infrastructure for effectively every single industry of the modern economy. Um, so I think there's a lot of unique power accumulating to what is effectively three companies, Amazon, Microsoft, and Google, and that's it. And I think we can start to distinguish nowadays between a sort of upper tier of the big tech companies, which would be, for me, those three companies, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, and then a second tier of companies that would be like Facebook, Apple, Tesla, whatever. I think the cloud companies and their infrastructural role in the economy has led to them being absolutely essential to so many things nowadays. That's only grown in the past couple of years with the rise of generative AI and the massive amounts of computing power that generative AI requires. So, the amount of money that these companies are now spending on building up data centers, on, building out submarine cables across the oceans, all of this is, it's unprecedented, the amount of money that they're now spending on this stuff. And for me, this is all partly for profit, but I think first and foremost for power. I think this is, one of the unique aspects of the present moment is that sort of sort of issues of power, I think, are becoming more significant than just profit per se.
Yes, I think this is a very important point. In the INCA project, we are using the notion of infrastructural power to come to grips with this aspect of kind of overwhelming power that platforms like Google, Microsoft, Facebook are accumulating. I guess we will ask back to this question later on. But before doing that, I would like to go back some years to the COVID-19 pandemic. During the pandemic, digital platforms gained a great visibility and made huge profits. Can we strike a balance more than 4 years after the outbreak of the pandemic of the mutations of the landscape of digital platforms? And more specifically, how have profits been invested by these platforms? Which are the main trends that you can discern?
Yeah, I think the COVID pandemic obviously was for the cloud companies a massive benefit, a massive boom. Um, if you look at every sort of company that became immensely popular over the course of the pandemic, so companies like Peloton and Netflix and various video game companies and things like that, all these things that people were doing when they were locked down at home, all of them rely on Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure or Google Cloud. They were all running off of these cloud platforms. They weren't operating their own data centers or anything like that. So every single big company that benefited from the pandemic was in fact paying significant amounts of money to these cloud companies. If you look at, for instance, this is one thing I like to keep track of is every quarter, financial statements released by these companies. And you look at Amazon, I think is one of the most interesting, particularly because when you look at Amazon's financial statements, what you see is that almost all of their profit comes from Amazon Web Services nowadays. Their e-commerce platform is not all that profitable. And in fact, during the pandemic, all of their profit came from their cloud computing. So these are huge, huge money makers. And I would argue rentiers, it's not just a sort of pure productive profit aspect. It's a rentier aspect that's going on in these situations. I think where these profits are going is another big question because back when I wrote Platform Capitalism, one of the big stories of the time was that these companies were basically just holding on to piles of cash, didn't have anywhere to profitably invest it. Um, there was also an issue around the taxation situation of America. I think it's a 35% repatriation rate for any sort of foreign profits made brought back into America, which meant that these companies, for them, it just made more sense to hold on to this cash than to actually invest it in anything. Today, that's quite different. I think today we're seeing all of these companies spend huge amounts of money on data centers. That's the key thing that they're buying right now. It's data centers. There's rumors, for instance, that OpenAI and Microsoft are building $100 billion supercomputer in order for OpenAI to do its stuff. This is where the profits are going at the moment. Is a huge amount of fixed capital being built up right now. Oh, and one other key thing, I think, not just into data centers, investments in startups. If you look at AI startups, where the money is coming from to fund them at the moment, it's actually not venture capital this time. Venture capital is involved, but the majority of it is coming from big tech companies. The amounts of money that are required for doing an AI startup nowadays is beyond sort of what venture capital can meaningfully offer. It's only big tech and increasingly sovereign wealth funds from Saudi Arabia and other places that are able to sort of support these AI startups at the moment. So these are where the profits are going, I would say.
Yes, I think this reference to investments in fixed capital is another important point, because it goes with what you were saying before about the accumulation of power, and in particular infrastructural power by these platforms. In a way, fixed capital is what enables the deployment and the exercise of infrastructural capital, which infrastructural power, which is, a kind of key political aspect of the working of these platforms. And I want to come now to the question of the politics of infrastructural digital platforms, which is, as I was saying before, at the center of the INCA project. We look at the politics of platforms considered as key capitalist actors from a double angle. I will put it very quickly, too quickly. On the one hand, we investigate lobbying activities at the national and European level, lobbying activities by big infrastructural platforms. On the other hand, we kind of pay attention to the political dimensions and effects of what I like to call the operations of digital platforms. In this second respect, we employ, for instance, the Foucauldian notion of government as conduct of conducts to shed light on the ways in which platforms guide and steer social behaviors. But I think also the issue of data is, of course, crucial in this respect, because the kind of extraction, accumulation, and storage, and management of data allows digital platforms, in a way, to compete with the sovereign competence of states. So I'd like to hear your opinion on this question.
Yeah, I think this is it's one of the more intriguing aspects of generative AI that I think hasn't really been picked up by many people is the ways in which it's being used to extend the power and the influence and the dependency on these cloud companies into areas which are traditionally deemed to be, functions of the state. I'll give two obvious examples, and then one I think which has gone wildly underreported, which is the military. But the two other examples are education. This week Google had its big developers conference, and loads of attention paid to the new, AI assistants that they're going to launch. Sort of quite amazing in many ways, technological developments that they have. What went sort of undernoticed, except by people sort of focused on it, is they also released a series of models specifically designed for education. So a series of generative AI models that are not their massive language models, Gemini and stuff, but instead ones which are specifically designed to be used in the context of education. So this is very much a play by Google to get its way into the educational system by providing sort of a foundational infrastructure for what they imagine education to look like. The other key area is healthcare, which again, Google has been massively invested in, Microsoft has been, Amazon has been, and Apple to a lesser degree. But again, Google, for instance, is releasing numerous models designed to be generative AI for medical practitioners. So to help them, with diagnoses, with answering questions, with all sorts of things. Not to mention on top of that, the sort of frontier research being done by DeepMind about, well, let's, build effectively recipes for the basic molecular aspects of life, building AI models to do that sort of thing. So from that sort of molecular level up to the social systems of modern healthcare, Google is making a play to have infrastructure at every single key level there. On top of all of that, there's also this military aspect, which I think is really worrying and wildly underreported. There has been, for instance, reports about Google's involvement with Project Nimbus in Israel, and the ways in which this stuff has been supporting, the ongoing genocide there. There's also, been reports about the use of AI in Israel's attacks on Gaza. But there's much less discussion of the ways in which these companies are providing cloud computing for the American military, for instance. The ways in which they're supporting military startups, the ways in which they're developing AI to do, autonomous flying of F-16s. All of this sort of stuff is being developed by these big tech companies. And again, they're positioning themselves as providing core infrastructure for core functions of the state. Now, I don't think this necessarily means that they're going to replace the state, but I think it does lead to a situation where you have this sort of mutual convergence of interest between the state, this geopolitical interests of the state, and the sort of commercial interest of these companies. And for me, this is one of the more worrying aspects of the present moment is that convergence. There has been some tension between big tech companies and government before, but that seems to be disappearing a lot at the present moment.
Yes, I agree with you. I mean, the prospect is not the replacement of the state by digital platforms or big tech. It is more a kind of hybridization and sectoral competition. So I think we have to pay attention to future developments in this respect. And you made a crucial point referring to the role of big tech in military developments in the current conjuncture of war, and to the complicity of big tech in the genocide that is going on in Gaza. So thank you for this. And maybe we will come back at the very end of our dialogue to this crucial question. But now I would like to hark back to the lively discussions of recent years surrounding the question of platform labor and its relation with data. And needless to say, this is, at least for me, a highly political issue. You are among the scholars and also activists who took a distance from theories of value production through online quote and unquote free labor to remind the notion that was introduced several years ago by Tiziana Terranova. I am perfectly aware of the important issues at stake here, including the distinction between abstract and concrete labor, as well as between rent and profit. And moreover, I think it is important to emphasize that online activity is not perceived as labor by users. And this matters. Although, the question, what is work, as you write in a recent book co-authored with Helen Hester, is again crucial today, particularly with respect to caring and social reproduction. But anyway, when you compare data with raw materials and natural resources, my simple and maybe naive observation is that the data do not exist in nature. They are rather produced. So what about this production of data? How can we, first of all, theoretically make sense of this important moment of production of data?
Yeah, I would absolutely agree for what it's worth. It's been some time since I looked through platform capitalism, so I can't exactly recall what my argument was there. But if I can remember correctly, it has to do with the fact that data can effectively be understood as the recording of some phenomenon in the world. And typically what we're interested in as critical scholars is the recording of social phenomenon, people acting, behaving in various ways, doing various things, the recording of that personal behavior and transforming it into personal data is the sort of initial process that goes on. And you're absolutely right that data is not just there. It's something which requires massive investments in various infrastructures. Nowadays we might think about wearables and stuff like that. The ways in which these things have had huge amounts of research and development and product design, and then all the stuff to get them out and to get people buying them, to then record their personal data. It is a production process, I think. Where I sort of see a similarity with something like oil is that oil is similarly, it's not just there. It requires being taken out of the ground. It requires being extracted. It requires huge amounts of investment to be able to get the stuff out, to be able to ship it around the world. Before big tech, and even until very recently, the biggest investors in fixed capital amongst the global economy were energy companies, precisely because it takes so much money to actually extract resources, to so much infrastructure to be able to do that. So I do see a lot of similarities there. I'm not wedded to my position, I should say. I think I'm quite open to alternative readings of it, but that for me, it seems like a plausible way of understanding what's at stake here with data and sort of understanding its role in the contemporary economy, I would say.
Yes, thank you very much. So I have a first question regarding the politics of digital platforms, and it is a question about the prospect of, let's say, alternative uses of platforms. This question usually raises the alternative between cooperatives and socialization that you discuss at the end of your 2016 book. So almost 10 years after writing the book, how do you evaluate this alternative? You were decidedly for socialization and state control back in 2016. Have you been thinking of different models in recent years of a possible combination of self-management and nationalization, for instance? You were mentioning several times during this dialogue generative artificial intelligence, and you know very well that there are debates about the possibility of kind of appropriating AI to rethink and reorganize a kind of socialist planning, you know, which, of course, would imply moments of self-management in order to cope with, let's say, the challenges of democracy. So my question is very general, but I would like to know if you have new thoughts about this important issue.
Yeah, I think one thing I find interesting since 2016 is the surprising lack of alternatives in practice. I sort of expected there to be much more in the way of particularly platform cooperatives developing. I know at a sort of grassroots level, there's, any number of platform cooperatives, but there's not really any that have sort of, you know, become significant actors in their own ways. Certainly nothing comparable with the big tech companies. And it's not necessarily something they have to aspire to, but there are no stories about Uber being replaced by a platform cooperative. Um, so this I find it somewhat surprising. I think in part it has to do with the financial power that can be wielded by these companies. If you're a platform cooperative and you try and go against a company like Uber, all they do is simply undercut you on prices until you go out of business, and then they jack the prices back up. They have an economic war chest that allows them to do that for an indefinite amount of time to take on any competitor. So I think that the things are set against a platform cooperative, and this is part of why I was somewhat skeptical of them in the platform capitalism book, because I do think the state needs to have a role there. Not necessarily building its own alternatives, but providing the sort of regulatory space and economic space for alternatives to arise. It requires state action. You could think of, for instance, London was going to ban Uber for a while. Actions like that, I think, are necessary if you want to actually have a platform cooperative come about. So my inclinations, I think, for alternatives haven't really changed much over the past 10 years or so. I'm just somewhat surprised that there's not more efforts to make alternatives, particularly at the level of municipalities. We had Barcelona, which tried a number of interesting, fascinating things to do with, more people-oriented technologies. But that's about it as far as I can really think of. And it seems to me like there's a real room here for some sort of action at a municipal level. And then there's the whole other question of, well, big tech, Amazon, Microsoft, Google, which I think is ultimately something perhaps definitely beyond the reach of a platform cooperative. I'll say that.
Yes, but maybe the challenge is to go beyond the alternative, between platform cooperativism and nationalization, let's put it so, and to look also, at the nature of public power today, both at the level of nation states and at the level of municipalities. you were rightly mentioning the financial logic, and I think that we can say that public power is kind of traversed by the financial logic, and this poses limits to the possibility of an alternative way of acting, also with respect to digital platforms. So maybe the problem is to reflect upon the conditions of a transformation of public power, of an emergence of a different kind of public power that makes the socialization of digital platforms, even a partial socialization of digital platforms possible.
Yeah, sorry, some of the connection broke up a little bit there, so I didn't quite get every single detail there. But I absolutely agree, and I think, I don't want to present a sort of artificial divide between nationalization and platform cooperatives, and I think there's many ways in which these things can be slotted together. And then just a quick point on the socialist planning question, which I think it remains fascinating, I think. And I think it's what the most recent sort of versions, I think, of artificial intelligence enable, and particularly generative AI and stuff, is less to do with, calculating, input-output matrices or something like that, which they could do as well. But it has more to do, I think, with stuff that Nick Dyer-Witherford was talking about over a decade ago, in this really fantastic little article, Red Plenty Platforms, sort of riffing on this book by Francis Bufford called Red Plenty, about the sort of utopian dreams and possibilities of the Soviet Union and the role of cybernetics in socialist planning. And Nick Dyer-Witherford's piece sort of builds off of this and thinks about, well, what could we imagine a future socialist society looking like, that was, highly technological, and sort of imagining ways in which, for instance, artificial agents could go about and, perform some of the mundane tasks involved in planning. Not the actual production process, but the actual planning process of going around, making decisions, making choices, setting values for society, making collective decisions at every single point. Either that requires a lot of meeting time by individuals, or we could think about agents and stuff like that sort of taking on some of this labor. And it's a really speculative essay, this piece by Dyer-Witherford, but I think some of the reality of it is coming true at the moment. So it's quite interesting for me what might be possible there.
Thank you. I would like to go on this issue. I hope we'll have another chance. Now I don't want to take too much time. And I want to conclude the first part of this dialogue by raising a question that many of us here consider particularly important. And this question can be encapsulated in Mark Davis and Jiang Xiao's call to de-Westernize platform studies, to look at processes of platformization in a global perspective, to analyze the homogeneity of these processes, but also the big differences, between China and Europe, to make an easy example. And in my recent work with Brett Nilsson, I focus on such processes of platformization in what we call a multipolar world, to investigate another political dimension of the operations of digital platforms, which means their geopolitical and geoeconomic implications, which of course bring us back to the question of, let's say, military use of digital technologies that you were rightly raising before. But again, I would like to hear your opinion on these wider vistas of the politics of digital platforms.
Yeah, so first on the de-Westernized platforms idea, I think absolutely necessary. I think there's been a load of good work that's been done on precisely this, looking at, various platforms in Latin America, Southeast Asia, and other places where these things have become immensely dominant and large. For me, my own research is on big tech, and big tech is of necessity at the moment. It's American and it's Chinese. No other platform from other regions competes in any real way with those two ecosystems of platforms, which leads to the geopolitical question of precisely China versus the US. And, I think it was just today or yesterday, the US announced a whole new slew of tariffs on a bunch of Chinese products and things like that. The trade wars between these companies and the economic nationalism is heating up massively. And for me, extremely worryingly, I think the risk of this tipping over into a conflict, an open conflict, is getting higher and higher every single day. It's extremely worrying. And for me, when that happens, and as we sort of progress towards that stage, the platforms, the entire ecosystems of these national giants are only going to be roped into the geopolitics of it all more and more so. I'll give one really recent example, and I think it's somewhat telling, is Microsoft invested a huge amount of money about a month ago into a UAE AI company called G42. The price of Microsoft being able to invest in that company was that G42 had to basically take away any Chinese aspects that they had involved. So any finances from them, any technologies from China had to be evacuated from the business in order to receive funding from an American company. And it seems to me that this is the process which is going on right now across the world, is a carving up. And I mean this in a very Leninist imperialist sense of carving up the rest of the world amongst these digital platforms. And this is the sort of struggle that's going on, and it's somewhat low level at the moment. But it seems to be a very real feature of what is happening at the present moment, and the emerging sort of fractures, not just geopolitically, but also on that sort of technological level as well.
Thank you. Now the floor is open. I guess we have a mic.
You have to comment, close to the microphone, please, or close to the computer. This chair, okay. Like this.
Or I can speak here?
No, here, please.
Okay.
Yeah, the chair will be to the comment.
Yes, mine is very broad questions, and it's both for Nick and for Sandro. We can consider platformization as the nuclear. Can you hear me?
Yes, of course.
Okay. So as a nuclear and the most important part of a broader process, which is the digital transition. And we consider digital transition as a process that reshape capitalism nowadays. But we can consider that there is also another process that nowadays is reshaping capitalism, which is energy transition. We are going through a transformation of our energetic system. So my question is, really broad, and I don't have an answer, but maybe is a good point for our common reflection, which is the relation between digital transition and energy transition, because we have some evident aspects. For example, data centers need a lot of energy, but so this, for example, today's Mattia presentation highlighted, for example, the investment of Amazon on the production of solar energy. Microsoft, for example, signed up a contract the last days for producing energy or wind energy or solar energy. I'm not sure, with another company, and they, addressing their investments to the energy production. So, which kind of power dimension we can read from the encounter between these two broader projects, which are encompassing projects also globally speaking?
Franco, maybe we collect a couple of comments and questions.
Eduardo is joining now.
Hello, Nick. Thanks for taking part of this roundtable. Really, well, I have a question for you. I mean, we talked about the role, the quasi-governmental role of large platform, and you mentioned, for example, all the military industry, and this kind of role in which is very similar to those of that the previous or traditionally was played by states. Now, my question is, in one respect, I mean, this is something that we have already seen. If we talk about military sector, for example, we know there are all the issue of the industry of private army, which has to do with more traditional industry. For example, Ali Barton, we know, is very active with one of a diversified company into this industry. There is a large literature that has to do with this quasi-governmental role within large global supply chain, where a big contractor actually play this role of government. So, I mean, my research question actually, and I'd like to hear what you think about, is what is different from the past? To what respect we are just like looking at the evolution of something that is ongoing, or is something that is not only different in quantity but also in quality. My personal take on this is that there is a difference, which is the balance of power between states and private company. I mean, if we see that the traditional relationship, you have big corporations that do lobby, they are very well, they have very good relation with politicians, but at the end of the day, what happened is that they became supplier within a territory that was in one way regulated by state law. Like if we think of privatization, when you privatize, there are rules that this company has to follow. In this case, we are really a shift in the kind of power that these companies can wield because of the infrastructure, because of the network externalities, or these very strong switching costs that they impose to clients, so that at the end is the states that has to follow in a way to regulate. It's not the opposite way that it was. So I think that probably the concept of infrastructure is what gives to these large companies some coercive power that it was typical of the states that now is kind of a share. So I like to because for me is a big question. So whether is a continuum or is something that is a kind of a jump. So I'd like to hear your opinion about that. Thank you.
So a third question, and then Nick replies.
Yes. Hi, Nick. Thanks for the presentation. So for the presentation, for the dialogue. So thanks also to Sandro. My question is the following. So you harking back to the power of platform, now the political power of platform. So you raised the question of fixed capital. So the investment in data center, the investment in submarine cables, and in so on and so forth. But my question is, don't you think that is not enough to grasp the power of platforms? I mean, I try to put it in another way. Do you think that if there would be a kind of public data center or a public dimension of a data center, this would be something that would contrast the power of GAFAM? Because I mean, the sense for me is that if you ask to a citizen if you would like to store to a citizen to store their data in the Google Cloud or in the public cloud, probably it would ask it would prefer to store their data in Google Cloud. So it's a kind of is what we define as a kind of hegemonic power that is far beyond the technical power of such actor. So I wanted to hear about your opinion about this point, which is a kind of tricky point somehow, but that is still important to try to also promote initiative that could contrast their power.
So thank you. And please, Nick.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for those questions. Really good. The first one on energy transition versus digital transition. I think the obvious sort of relationship here is that the digital transition is driving energy usage, and the energy transition is trying to maybe not necessarily reduce energy usage, but at the very least, transform it into a renewable source of energy. I think that there is that really important tension. You see it playing out in the actions of the big tech companies. And this is another really interesting aspect of them that isn't discussed as much. So you mentioned, the investment in renewals by these companies. They routinely, when they build a new data center nowadays, they'll also build a wind farm nearby to get energy for these things, or a solar farm and things like that. But there's also a growing interest by these companies in building small nuclear plants. So I'll give two examples. Microsoft has been openly hiring for people to do nuclear power plants. They've also Amazon has also recently bought a data center which was located right next to a nuclear power plant, and that data center will get all of its energy from that power plant. And there's lots of speculation that they're going to be trying to build up their own nuclear power plants in the near-term future. So yeah, I mean, these big tech companies are moving into energy provision as well. On one level, it's good. The fact that they're investing in wind farms, the fact they're investing in solar farms and this sort of stuff. You can contrast it with like the crypto use of technology, where crypto is basically just siphoning off and, using coal power effectively. The AI data centers are slightly different. The problem is that the demand for energy by them is so much that their renewable sources aren't able to keep up. And so you have situations popping up around the world where local communities are running out of energy because the data centers are taking it all. And really interestingly, there was a story in, I think it was Norway, where a military arms company was complaining that the local data center was taking energy that they needed. So they were complaining that TikTok was effectively taking all the energy that they needed to make weapons. So, a real sort of contrast here between these military sectors and the big tech sectors on that level. I think there is this sort of competition there, and I think it's going to be rife for conflict. The growth of energy use by these companies, and there's also a rife for conflict in terms of the geopolitics of these supply chains that you need to get things like renewable energy. So lithium for batteries, for instance, is one of the big examples. Lithium sources there's a fair amount of it, but it's sort of placed in specialized areas around the world. And then China has sort of a real choke point in one part of the supply chain. So, there's real geopolitical aspects that are emerging for the energy transition, which I think also then combine with the digital aspects of supply chains. So yeah, it's complicated, I think, and but really, really crucially important. The second question, yeah, it's a really good one as well, on what is different about big tech's relationship with military today versus, corporations' involvement with military in previous periods and, ongoing. How is Amazon's involvement with the military different from Lockheed Martin, I think is, one way to pose this question. And for me, I think it's largely a difference in quantity. But it is, the infrastructure question is again crucial here, because I think infrastructure is, there's a level of dependency by the US military, to give a clear example. There's a level of dependency on infrastructure that is different from dependency on an F-16, on some company producing one particular, weapon. So that I think is somewhat unique. The other thing I would say, which is unique, is this notion of weaponized interdependence. So it comes from Abraham Newman and Henry Farrell. This idea that the same global systems which allow commerce to interact and allow globalization to spread around the world, those same systems are also capable of being weaponized by whoever's in control of them. So we can think about, for instance, the SWIFT financial communication network, which the US has used to block what they deem to be rogue states from the system. But increasingly, this is also digital platforms. So digital platforms and the digital infrastructure that's involved here. So the growing ownership of big tech over submarine cables, for instance, I think is part and parcel of weaponized interdependence. And I think the reliance of the state on these companies for this infrastructure, I think is somewhat unique and different from, like, say, what Lockheed Martin might have. And the last question, yeah, is fixed capital sort of sufficient for power? I think it's necessary but not sufficient, if I would maybe put it that way. I think you're absolutely right about the sort of hegemonic aspects. People choosing Google Cloud over a state cloud, I think is a good example. There's a certain level of, consensus to big tech controlling this stuff, which is it's not just down to, it's not down to coercion or anything like that. It's much more about a sort of hegemonic idea. That being said, I think fixed capital is a necessary condition, and the amount of fixed capital which is required is such that it's only a handful of companies in the world. The three big ones in the West, and then maybe Alibaba and Tencent in China. It's very few companies which are able to compete at this level.
So maybe I can add a couple of quick notes on Franco's question. The first one is that we are currently witnessing a kind of hijacking of both the digital and the energy transition in a conjunction of war. The kind of diversion of investments, of research projects that we have been witnessing over the last couple of years in the field of generative artificial intelligence is really kind of amazing and threatening. And the same is true for the energy transition, because of the military needs. The energy transition has been diverted over the last 2 years in Europe and in other parts of the world. The second note picks up on a point that has been mentioned by Nick, which means that one of the most important overarching questions that keep together the digital and the energy transition is the question of so-called critical minerals. And critical minerals have important geopolitical and geoeconomic implications, which brings me back to the question of the current conjuncture of war, of the competition between the US and China, and so on. One of the most important critical minerals, so-called critical minerals, that is needed both for the digital and for the energy transition is lithium. One of the hugest concentration of lithium is in Latin America, in the south of Latin America, in the so-called lithium triangle, which means Chile, the northwest of Argentina, and Bolivia. So if you look at those three countries, those three areas, you see very different models of regulation of extraction. You have nationalization in Bolivia, but the way in which nationalization has been pursued makes Bolivia weaker on the world market. You have kind of mixed companies in Chile, and now a kind of wild privatization in the northwest of Argentina. But in a way, you could look at this part of the world also from a different angle. You could imagine progressive governments, even socialist governments ruling these three countries and kind of combining their efforts in order to manage in a different way the extraction of lithium and, the relation with the world market. Why am I saying this? Because I think we have to raise the question of a possible counter hijacking of the digital and energy transition. I was saying that the military is hijacking these two transitions. Is a counter hijacking possible? Is it possible to put it in a very quick way to introduce the question of the socialist transition in the discussion of the digital and the energy transition? It may seem kind of unrealistic question, but I do not think this is the case. In Latin America, for instance, there have been lively debates among social movements and progressive governments on this possibility. And I think we have to raise again this question. I repeat, the question of the transition to socialism in the discussion of digital and energy transition. Maybe unrealistic from a political point of view. I think it is crucial from the point of view of method. So now we have 20 minutes. More comments, questions? Not necessarily on the transition to socialism, I mean. So if there are no more comments, questions,
There is a comment in the chat
okay.
saying, Filippo Vignami, many thanks both for the inspiring discussion and inputs. I need
Okay.
to leave. Thank you.
Thank you
Filippo.
so much, Filippo. Mhm. So if there are no more comments, okay, sorry.
No, just to be honest, I was saying that I am leaving, unfortunately. So I want to thank you for the inspiring and really, really effective inputs and discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Filippo.
Thank you, Filippo. For the third time, I say if there are no more comments or questions, I think we can conclude this session that has been really very interesting and inspiring. I would like to thank on behalf of the whole INCA team Nick for his generosity, and I hope we'll have soon a chance to meet in person.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me.